March 17, 1943. The North Atlantic was a black, raging battlefield long before a single shot was fired. Towering waves, some more than 15 feet high, crashed against the steel hulls of the ships like walls of frozen iron. The wind cut across the decks like sharp knives, tearing at uniforms, whipping faces, and making even the strongest men stumble. Convoy HX-229-41 merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and ammunition, the last lifeline for a starving Britain, pressed forward through the storm, their engines groaning under the relentless pressure. Every ship strained to survive the chaos of the ocean, and every sailor knew they were being hunted. On the bridge of the Liberty ship SS William Eustis, Captain James Bannerman clutched the icy railing as the deck rolled beneath his boots. His eyes swept the dark horizon, searching for any sign of the enemy. The night offered no clues, yet Bannerman felt every movement, every shift in the water, as if the ocean itself were alive with danger. Deep below the surface, in the silent, cold darkness, German U-boats waited. Motionless. Patient. Lurking like predators, their periscopes barely visible above the waves. They did not need to move. The convoy broadcasted its presence with every turn of a propeller, every vibration of a steel hull. Inside the cramped control room of one of the submarines, a hydrophone operator pressed his headphones tighter to his ears. He listened to the mechanical symphony of the convoy, propellers thumping, engines vibrating, steel frames groaning. To the Germans, this chaos was not random, it was music guiding them to their prey. And while captains above and officers below prepared for battle, the Atlantic held a secret. Far from the icy wind and the groaning hulls, in the hot, narrow galley of the William Eustis, a man scrubbed dishes. Thomas Patrick Lawson, 28, American and seemingly ordinary, moved quietly among the steam and clatter of pots and pans. He had no military training, no experience with naval strategy, no authority. No one expected him to notice anything important about the war raging around him. Yet Lawson had a gift, an attention to detail that no one else on the ship possessed. While men above fretted over torpedoes and radar readings, Lawson listened. He noticed vibrations, subtle hums of machinery, the rhythm of engines, and how the ship itself responded to the violent waves. The contrast could not have been more extreme. Above deck, men shouted orders, scanned the horizon, and clung to railings for dear life. Below, Lawson moved like a shadow, calm and observant, his hands busy with simple tasks that somehow connected him to the heartbeat of the ship. While the captain and crew worried about detection, a single pair of eyes and ears was silently studying the orchestra of the ship, reading the vibrations that traveled through steel, water, and the hull itself. The danger was very real. Every mile of the Atlantic was a gamble. Each merchant ship carried not just cargo, but the survival of an island nation. 2/3 of Britain's food came by sea. Every lost ship meant families starving, cities running out of fuel, and soldiers fighting without ammunition. German U-boats were not only weapons, they were hunters, and their hydrophones were frighteningly efficient. A single ship could be heard from 12 miles away. A convoy could be tracked across 50 miles of open ocean. The Allies had tried everything: zigzagging routes, radio silence, early sonar systems that barely worked, rubber coatings, vibration mounts. Nothing could stop the sound that revealed their location. Every expert had agreed, the problem was impossible. But Thomas Lawson, a cook, was about to notice something no one else had. While the engineers, scientists, and admirals believed they had exhausted every solution, Lawson had observed the ship in motion for days. He had felt the vibration through the floors, heard the subtle shifts of propellers, and understood something the experts could not. The Atlantic, in all its cold and fury, was giving him information. It spoke to him in hums, tremors, and the subtle interplay of machinery against water. And he was listening. In that moment, amid the groaning ships, crashing waves, and hidden predators below, the Atlantic's deadliest secret waited to be uncovered. While expert eyes scanned the horizon and commanders planned defenses, a quiet American cook in the galley, hands wet and soapy, noticed what no one else could. A simple observation, a curiosity about vibrations, would soon become the key to saving thousands of lives. The Atlantic was a battlefield, merciless and unforgiving. Every ship and sailor was at the mercy of the waves and the hidden U-boats beneath. Yet, in the belly of the William Eustis, Thomas Patrick Lawson prepared to challenge the impossible. The calm, observant cook was about to discover a secret that could turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. And no one, not the admirals, not the engineers, not the enemies beneath the waves, had any idea it was coming. Hook for the next part. While men fought with guns and ships above, the future of thousands rested in the hands of a cook who only had his eyes, his ears, and his curiosity. The Atlantic was unforgiving. By early 1943, the war at sea had become a graveyard. Merchant ships burned on the surface, oil slicks stretched for miles, and the waves carried the wreckage of a war Britain was dangerously close to losing. Every convoy that left North America carried more than food and fuel, it carried hope. Hope for civilians in London, for soldiers on distant fronts, for a nation clinging to survival. But hope was fragile. For 3 long years, German U-boats had stalked the Atlantic like ghosts. They moved silently beneath the waves, invisible and unstoppable. The Allies' losses were catastrophic. In March alone, U-boats sank hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo, and the numbers climbed so fast that British officials quietly admitted the unthinkable. If sinkings continued at this pace, Britain would run out of food within 3 months. Not low on supplies, completely out. The threat was not exaggerated. Germany did not need to invade Britain. Starve it and victory would follow. U-boats were not just submarines, they were hunters equipped with technology years ahead of the Allies. Their hydrophones listened with precision that seemed impossible. Every propeller blade, every engine hum, every shiver of steel traveled through water, carrying signals for miles. To Allied sailors, the ocean was darkness. To U-boat commanders, it was full of voices. The experts tried everything. The Royal Navy deployed ASDIC, an early sonar system, designed to detect submarines at a distance. On paper it seemed perfect. In reality it was narrow, fragile, and limited. It could only see directly in front of the ship. U-boats quickly learned to attack from angles ASDIC could not cover. Escorts charged toward phantom echoes while torpedoes struck the freighters from directions no sonar could warn against. Then came Huff Duff, a clever radio detection system. It worked, but only if submarines transmitted messages. Wolf packs soon stopped transmitting entirely, using the very sound of the convoy to guide them. Every more expensive or complex solution failed. Engineers tried coating hulls with rubber to absorb vibrations. The material peeled off and slowed the ships, making them easier targets. Propeller redesigns shattered under the stress of the ocean. Vibration-dampening mounts were proposed, but installing them across the fleet would take decades. Physics itself seemed against the Allies. The Atlantic was a deafening trap, and no amount of money, manpower, or genius could solve the problem. And yet, someone was noticing what no one else could. Thomas Patrick Lawson, the 28-year-old cook, wandered into the engine room again and again. While the sailors above played cards or wrote letters, and while engineers cursed under the roar of turbines, Lawson felt the vibrations through the steel deck and bulkheads. He did not understand the equations, but he understood the music of the machinery. He could separate the high-pitched whine of turbines from the deep thrum of propeller shafts. To him, the engine room was not chaos, it was information. Then came the night that changed everything. A nearby ship in the convoy was hit by a torpedo. Lawson felt the moment the vessel began to die. First the explosion, then the groaning collapse, and finally the rush of thousands of tons of seawater. And then silence. Not the natural silence of the ocean, but the silence of a ship that vanished from the U-boat's hydrophones. It struck him immediately, air-filled ships made noise. Ships filled with water became ghosts. The insight was simple yet profound. Could water be used to absorb vibrations, to silence the machinery that betrayed ships to the enemy? Lawson sketched his idea on scraps of paper, steel chambers filled with water, strategically placed around the propeller shafts and engine mounts. The idea was bold, almost absurd, but it made sense to him. And while the idea seemed ridiculous to anyone else, Lawson could not ignore it. He first approached the ship's engineers and officers. They laughed. They scolded him, told him to return to the galley. "You're a cook, not an inventor," they said. But Lawson persisted. He kept listening, kept studying, kept refining his crude sketches. He noticed patterns that no one else could see. He trusted his instincts. The stakes could not have been higher. Britain's survival depended on the convoys crossing the Atlantic. Every ship lost was thousands of lives at risk. Experts had given up. Admirals admitted defeat. Yet, in the belly of a shaking Liberty ship, Lawson dared to imagine a solution. It was not science or technology that guided him, it was observation, attention to detail, and a refusal to accept the impossible. Lawson's insight would soon bring him face to face with the commanders of the Western approaches. What started as an unassuming cook noticing vibrations in the engine room was about to become the last hope for the Allies in the Atlantic. If his idea worked, thousands of lives could be spared. If it failed, it would join the long list of impossible solutions. But for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope, and it came from the least expected source. A man whose greatest weapons were curiosity and courage. Above the waves, the convoys pressed forward, unaware of the storm below the surface. Below the decks, engines roared, propellers churned, and U-boats waited silently. And in the middle of it all, Thomas Patrick Lawson began to turn the tide, not with guns, not with medals, not with orders, but with a simple, brilliant observation that would change naval warfare forever. Hook for Part 3. From the galley to the command center, Lawson's idea would soon be tested. A single cook standing against the might of the German U-boats, armed only with his curiosity and a bold plan. The Atlantic was relentless. Convoy HX-229 pressed forward through the icy darkness, every ship groaning against the waves, every sailor knowing that death could strike without warning. Above deck, men scanned the horizon for periscopes, called out positions, and braced for the inevitable torpedo strikes. Below deck, the engine room roared like a living beast, and somewhere in the middle of this mechanical chaos, Thomas Patrick Lawson moved quietly, his hands wet from scrubbing, his eyes scanning the vibrating steel around him. Lawson had noticed something unusual over the past few weeks. The machinery of the ship created vibrations that traveled through the hull and into the surrounding water. Most sailors ignored it. Most engineers only saw it as noise, something to withstand, not study. But Lawson listened. He felt the vibrations under his feet, in his hands against the bulkheads, and in his ears as the engines hummed. And then, on a cold February night, the insight came. A nearby ship in the convoy was struck by a torpedo. Lawson felt the explosion through the hull of the William Eustace. First came the violent shudder, then the groaning collapse of steel, followed by the rush of water as the vessel sank. And then, a silence unlike any other. Not the silence of the ocean, but the silence that spoke of a ship that had vanished from the sensors of every U-boat in the area. It was an accident, a disaster, yet in that moment, Lawson understood something the greatest minds of the Allied Navy had overlooked. Air-filled ships made noise. Steel, engines, and machinery broadcasted every movement into the water. But water, heavy, dense, unyielding, swallowed vibrations. A ship partially filled with water, or with water surrounding the vibrating machinery, became almost invisible to the deadly ears of the German U-boats. The idea struck him with the clarity of lightning. What if the loudest parts of a ship, the engines and propeller shafts, could be surrounded with water-filled chambers to absorb vibrations? The ship would not sink. It would not be destroyed. But it would become stealthy, nearly silent to the hydrophones that had tormented the Allies for years. Lawson could barely contain the excitement in his chest. He grabbed scraps of paper and began sketching crude diagrams of pipes, tanks, and chambers. He drew water-filled bladders pressing against the engine mounts, steel boxes filled with liquid surrounding the propeller shafts. It was a simple concept, almost laughably basic, yet its implications were staggering. If it worked, it could save thousands of lives, protect vital cargo, and change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. But Lawson was a cook, not an engineer. He had no formal training in physics, acoustics, or naval design. He had spent years observing, listening, and thinking, but now he faced a new challenge, convincing someone else that his idea could work. He first approached the ship's chief engineer, a gruff man accustomed to orders from above. Lawson laid out his sketches, explained his observations, and described the accident that had inspired the concept. The engineer laughed, shaking his head. "You're a cook, Lawson. Go back to your galley. Leave the science to the experts." Undeterred, Lawson tried the first mate, then other officers. Each dismissal stung, but it did not stop him. The Atlantic had taught him patience. He knew that survival often came from small observations ignored by everyone else. He kept refining his sketches, kept feeling the vibrations, kept imagining how water could shield the ships from the deadly ears of the U-boats. Days turned into nights, and Lawson's obsession grew. He spent hours in the engine room, moving from the propeller shafts to the turbines, noting the tiniest hums, the faintest shudders. To him, the ship was no longer just a vessel. It was an instrument, an orchestra of metal and machinery, playing a song only he could hear. He could separate the notes, the high-pitched whine of a turbine, the deep rumble of a propeller, the subtle thump of the hull as it cut through waves. And in that symphony he found a secret, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be turned into salvation. Finally, he decided to take the boldest step of all. Lawson would present his idea to someone with authority, someone who could actually act. He did not approach the Admiralty in London, nor did he try to convince the Royal Navy engineers in Liverpool at first. Instead, he sought out Commander Peter Gretton, a battle-hardened officer known for his keen mind and willingness to try new tactics. Gretton had seen the destruction caused by the U-boats firsthand. He had watched convoy after convoy sink, helpless against the invisible threat. Lawson approached Gretton with his sketches, his observations, and his quiet confidence. The commander raised an eyebrow, skeptical. A cook with a notebook claiming he could silence ships? It sounded ridiculous. Yet there was something in Lawson's eyes, something that spoke of careful observation, of hours spent studying patterns, of intelligence hidden behind humility. Gretton agreed to a small-scale test. The Atlantic had not seen anything like this. A simple, untrained cook, ignored by experts, was about to challenge the might of the U-boat. The stakes were enormous. If Lawson's idea failed, it would be dismissed as foolishness. If it succeeded, it could change the war. In the engine room, amidst the roaring machinery, one man had dared to imagine a way to make the impossible possible. And that man was Thomas Patrick Lawson. Hook for Part 4. A single cook's idea was about to face its first real test. In a small corvette called HMS Sunflower, the Atlantic's deadliest predators would soon discover a new kind of threat, one they could not hear. By early March 1943, Thomas Patrick Lawson's idea was no longer just a sketch on paper. It had caught the attention of Commander Peter Gretton, the battle-hardened officer desperate for any edge against the relentless U-boats of the North Atlantic. The concept was simple in theory: surround the ship's noisy machinery, the propeller shafts, engine mounts, and turbines, with water-filled chambers to absorb vibrations, muffling the sounds that gave away the convoy's location. But simple in theory did not mean easy in practice. Lawson's first task was to convince the engineers and crew of the HMS Sunflower, a small corvette chosen for the test, that his cook's idea could work. Skepticism ran deep. The engineers shook their heads, muttered under their breaths, and called it a makeshift plumbing scheme. You can't just fill pipes with water and expect to hide a ship from the most advanced hydrophones in the world, one senior engineer scoffed. Even Commander Gretton admitted, under his breath, that the odds of success were slim. Undeterred, Lawson worked tirelessly. He drew detailed diagrams, corrected measurements, and explained the principle of vibration absorption in simple terms. The key, he insisted, was not to flood the ship but to isolate the vibrations at the source, allowing water to carry the energy away before it escaped into the ocean. 4 hours he supervised the installation, checking each chamber, each rubber bladder pressed against the engine mounts, and every steel plate welded around the propeller shafts. Finally, the day of the first test arrived. The Sunflower cut through the icy waves under a gray, overcast sky. A friendly submarine stationed nearby would act as the observer, listening carefully to the acoustic signature of the corvette. Lawson stood on the deck, hands gripping the railing, heart pounding as Gretton and the engineers watched with skepticism. The first trial began. The Sunflower accelerated to full speed. The submarine's hydrophones strained, recording every hum, every vibration. Lawson felt the ship's vibrations through his feet, comparing them with what he had imagined. At first there was hope. Then disaster. The water-filled chambers rattled, leaked, and amplified some sounds instead of muffling them. The engineers groaned, convinced it was a failure. Gretton's face was tight, skeptical. "I told you it was foolish," muttered one officer. Lawson, however, did not panic. He had expected setbacks. He studied the problem, adjusted the positioning of the chambers, sealed leaks, and reinforced the mounts. "We try again," he said quietly, his voice steady, his mind focused. "We learn from the mistakes." 3 days later, the second trial commenced. Every adjustment had been made with painstaking care. The Sunflower surged forward through the choppy Atlantic waters. The friendly submarine listened once more, waiting for the usual torrent of mechanical noise. And then, something remarkable happened. The hydrophones registered almost nothing. The Sunflower moved with near silence, its engines humming softly, its vibrations almost completely absorbed by Lawson's carefully placed chambers. Commander Gretton stared in disbelief, his hand trembling slightly as he clutched the railing. The engineers were silent, mouths agape. The impossible had happened. A simple cook's observation, refined with attention and persistence, had produced a solution that all the experts said could not exist. The success was not only technical but symbolic. For years, the Allies had believed that nothing could hide a convoy from the ears of the U-boats. Now, the first proof existed: a small corvette, moving silently through the deadly Atlantic, defying physics, engineering, and expectations. Lawson's idea had shifted from a theory to a real, tangible solution that could save lives. The implications were staggering. If this system could work on a small corvette, could it be scaled to larger merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and ammunition to Britain? Could it be used to turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, protecting the lifeline of an entire nation? Gretton realized that this was more than a clever trick. It was a revolution in naval warfare. Lawson, however, remained humble. He did not seek glory or recognition. He had noticed a problem, thought carefully, and acted. The rest of the world could call it genius, he called it observation. He spent the rest of the day walking the Sunflower, checking the chambers, listening to the machinery, and imagining how this principle could be applied to the massive convoys that still sailed under constant threat. The next challenge was clear: real combat. The test in controlled conditions had been successful, but would the system work under the pressure of enemy attack? The stakes could not have been higher. Every ship lost meant hundreds of lives gone, every convoy sunk meant vital supplies lost. Lawson's idea had to move from theory and trial into action, and the Atlantic offered no mercy for mistakes. Yet, for the first time in years, there was hope. A cook had discovered a secret hidden in plain sight. A simple principle, using water to absorb and dampen vibrations, was about to face the ultimate test against the deadliest predators of the Atlantic. Hook for Part 5. The first test had succeeded, but the real challenge lay ahead. Lawson's idea would now confront the most dangerous enemy in the Atlantic, the German U-boat Wolfpacks, in a battle where thousands of lives hung in the balance. By April 1943, the Atlantic remained a graveyard of steel and lives. The U-boats hunted with deadly precision, and the Allies struggled to protect the convoys that carried Britain's survival. Every merchant ship that sank represented thousands of men lost, vital supplies destroyed, and a nation inching closer to starvation. The stakes could not have been higher. After the success of the HMS Sunflower trials, Commander Peter Gretton and the Royal Navy realized the potential of Thomas Patrick Lawson's idea. A simple cook, dismissed by engineers and officers alike, had discovered a method to silence ships, to make them nearly invisible to the U-boat's sensitive ears. But success in a controlled test was one thing. Real combat was another. The next step was dangerous and unprecedented. Install Lawson's system on actual merchant ships and see if it could survive the full fury of a U-boat attack. 6 merchant ships were selected for the operational test, including Lawson's own ship, the SS William Eustace. Retrofitting them required ingenuity, speed, and precision. Engineers and dockworkers worked around the clock. Steel chambers filled with water were welded around propeller shafts, water-filled rubber bladders were pressed tightly against engine mounts, and every noisy component of the ship was carefully isolated. The modifications were simple yet meticulous. Total installation time per ship was just 64 hours, a fraction of the time the Allies had spent designing more complex, failed solutions. The crew of the William Eustace watched as Lawson supervised the installation, quiet but determined. He did not boast or demand recognition. He simply ensured every detail matched his observations from the engine room. The ships were ready. Their fate, and the lives of thousands, would soon be tested against the most dangerous enemy in the Atlantic, the German U-boat Wolfpacks. On April 22, 1943, convoy ONS 184 departed Liverpool. 43 merchant ships sailed in 9 columns, escorted by 6 corvettes and 2 destroyers. The 6 modified ships were spread throughout the formation, their positions unknown even to the U-boat commanders. For the Germans it was business as usual. Wolfpack Misa, patrolling the Atlantic, listened intently for the familiar hum of propellers that guided them to their prey. They expected easy targets, vessels broadcasting their location across miles of water. But something was different. The modified ships were silent. Their engines no longer betrayed their presence. Propeller vibrations that once carried signals for miles were now absorbed by Lawson's water-filled chambers and rubber mounts. The U-boat commanders strained their hydrophones, trying to detect the missing sound. Confusion spread through the Wolfpack. The submarines hunted in vain, targeting only the ships they could hear. The 6 retrofitted vessels slipped through the Atlantic undetected, ghosts among the convoys. For the Allies the results were staggering. Over the next 18 hours, relentless attacks rained down on the convoy. Torpedoes streaked through the dark waves, explosions rocked the unmodified ships, and sailors clung to life as chaos erupted around them. Yet not a single one of the 6 modified ships was hit. Lawson's system worked under the harshest conditions imaginable. His simple principle, born from observation in a galley, had shifted the balance of the battle. Commander Gretton could hardly believe it. Years of failed experiments, endless engineering solutions, and expensive technology had been outperformed by a cook's insight. Engineers who had once mocked Lawson now stood silent, witnessing proof that simplicity, observation, and courage could achieve what experts had deemed impossible. The operational test proved more than the technical success of the system. it demonstrated its strategic value. U-boat commanders, accustomed to striking from a distance, now had to operate blind, moving dangerously close to escorts before detecting targets. Wolfpack tactics, once nearly invincible, began to falter. The psychological advantage shifted. The Atlantic, once dominated by fear, offered a glimmer of hope. Lawson, however, remained humble. He did not celebrate. He did not seek medals or accolades. He walked the decks quietly, checking the chambers, listening to the hum of the engines and noting every detail. For him, the success was not glory, it was survival. Every ship that slipped through undetected meant lives saved, families spared, and a nation still standing. The operational test marked the beginning of a new chapter in naval warfare. Lawson's acoustic dampening system would soon be installed on hundreds of merchant ships, dramatically reducing detection ranges, lowering losses, and protecting the vital lifeline to Britain. His simple idea, a cook noticing subtle vibrations, experimenting and daring to act, had become a powerful weapon. But the battle was not yet over. The Atlantic remained treacherous and the Germans adapted quickly. Lawson's system would be tested again and again, facing the full fury of wolfpacks, storms, and the unpredictable chaos of war. The coming months would prove whether a single insight, executed with courage and precision, could truly alter the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. Hook for Part 6. The operational test had succeeded, but Lawson's greatest challenge lay ahead, scaling the system to protect hundreds of ships in the deadliest months of the war, and proving that a cook's idea could save thousands of lives in a battle where failure meant death. The success of the operational test had proven one critical truth. A single cook's insight could save lives. But one convoy and 6 retrofitted ships were only the beginning. The Battle of the Atlantic raged on and thousands of lives were still at risk. If Lawson's acoustic dampening system was to make a real difference, it had to be scaled, fast, efficiently, and across the fleet. The Western Approaches Command in Liverpool understood the urgency. Every convoy that left North America carried Britain's lifeline: food, oil, ammunition, and hope. But U-boats were relentless, attacking at night from angles sonar could not detect, and using the sound of the ships themselves to locate targets. Losses had reached catastrophic levels. In February 1943 alone, over 500,000 tons of shipping had been sunk. Britain's survival depended on bold action, and Lawson's system offered that chance. Installation teams worked around the clock. Steel chambers were welded, rubber bladders pressed into place, and every engine mount treated with meticulous care. A single ship could be modified in just 48 hours, a remarkable achievement given the speed at which convoys sailed and the limited resources of wartime shipyards. By July 1943, 847 ships had received the acoustic modifications. Each ship that slipped silently through the Atlantic represented thousands of lives saved and cargo preserved. Convoy losses plummeted. Detection ranges dropped from over 11 miles to less than half a mile. German U-boat commanders, accustomed to striking from a safe distance, found themselves suddenly exposed, dangerously close to escorts and radar-equipped ships before detecting their prey. Wolfpack tactics, once nearly invincible, began to collapse. Chaos spread through the U-boat lines. Ships that should have been easy targets moved undetected, ghost-like, through the ocean's deadly expanse. May 1943 would become a turning point. Known to history as Black May, it marked the first month in years when the Allies gained the upper hand in the Atlantic. For the first time, merchant convoys were not simply hoping to survive, they were actively protected by a new technology born not from engineers in labs, but from a cook in a Liberty ship's galley. U-boat losses skyrocketed by 400%, while Allied losses plummeted. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Atlantic shifted from a nightmare of fear to a battlefield where innovation, observation, and courage prevailed. Despite the dramatic success, Lawson remained humble. He never sought interviews, medals, or public recognition. He continued to oversee installations quietly, checking the vibrations, listening to the hum of engines, and ensuring each ship met the standard he had envisioned. For him, the greatest reward was the knowledge that sailors who would have perished were now reaching port safely, their families spared from grief. The system also proved cost-effective. Each modification cost roughly $20,000 per ship, a fraction of the price of more elaborate solutions that had failed. Time, money, and manpower were all conserved, yet the impact was monumental. A single insight, executed with precision and scaled intelligently, had altered the trajectory of the war at sea. Black May proved that even in the deadliest months of the Atlantic campaign, innovation could prevail. Allied convoys began to move with newfound confidence. Ships that had once been vulnerable to every Wolfpack strike were now protected by silent, invisible defenses. And while the U-boats adapted, their advantage had been irreversibly diminished. They could no longer rely on sound alone to hunt their prey. The ocean that had once betrayed the Allies now offered them cover, thanks to Lawson's vision. But Lawson's work did more than save lives. It changed naval warfare. The principle behind his acoustic dampening system, the isolation of vibrations and absorption of mechanical noise, would influence future naval design for decades. Modern navies around the world now use sophisticated noise reduction systems, but the core idea remains the same. Control the vibrations and you control the sound. In the midst of this success, Lawson remained an ordinary man doing extraordinary work. He never took credit, never sought fame, and never claimed heroism. Yet his impact was undeniable. Tens of thousands of sailors owed their lives to his curiosity, his careful observation, and his courage to act when no one else dared. Convoys that would have been easy prey slipped through undetected, cargoes that seemed destined for the ocean floor reached port, and Britain's survival, once in doubt, was secured. Hook for Part 7. Lawson's system had turned the tide, but the story was far from over. Beyond the Atlantic, his quiet brilliance would leave a legacy that shaped naval warfare for generations, and proved that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never seek the spotlight. By the summer of 1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had begun to turn. The once dreaded German U-boats, masters of underwater hunting, now struggled to detect convoys. Ships that had previously been easy prey slipped silently through the icy Atlantic, their vital cargoes reaching Britain intact. Tens of thousands of lives, once at constant risk, were now protected. And at the heart of this quiet revolution stood a man no one would have expected. A simple cook from Boston named Thomas Patrick Lawson. Lawson had never sought fame. He did not speak of his innovation, and he avoided attention, preferring the quiet routine of his galley and the hum of the engine room to ceremonies or accolades. Yet his work had become the backbone of Allied convoy strategy. The acoustic dampening system he had devised, a simple, elegant solution of water-filled chambers and vibration-absorbing mounts, had saved thousands of lives and preserved the flow of essential supplies across the Atlantic. The system was gradually installed fleet-wide. Every retrofitted merchant ship became a silent guardian, moving almost invisibly through waters that had once been a graveyard. The principle Lawson discovered, control the vibrations, control the sound, remained simple but profoundly effective. Convoy losses dropped dramatically, while U-boat effectiveness declined, shifting the balance in the Allies' favor. Black May of 1943 marked a turning point, but the impact of Lawson's innovation would resonate far beyond a single month. Despite his humility, Lawson's achievements did not go entirely unnoticed. The Western Approaches Command quietly recognized the significance of his contribution. By the end of the war, his system had been credited with saving an estimated 4,200 merchant seamen, and its principles would influence naval engineering for decades. The Allies had finally discovered a secret weapon in the fight against U-boats, one that required no enormous budgets, no cutting-edge labs, and no titles. Just observation, ingenuity, and the courage to act. In 1945, Lawson was awarded the British Empire Medal, a quiet recognition of the extraordinary role he had played in the war. He accepted it without fanfare, declining interviews and public attention. For him, the medal was not a reward, it was a confirmation that his simple idea had worked, that thousands had survived, and that the countless hours spent listening and observing in a noisy engine room had made a real difference. After the war, Lawson returned to Boston, resuming a life as ordinary as it was meaningful. He opened a small diner in Dorchester, married, had children, and lived modestly, content in the knowledge that his work had mattered far more than recognition. His story remained largely unknown to the public for decades, but the sailors who had survived the Atlantic remembered. At his funeral in 1991, 3 elderly British naval officers, men who had served on convoy escorts during Lawson's modifications, placed a handwritten note in his casket. "Because of you we came home." Even beyond the personal gratitude of survivors, Lawson's legacy endured in naval strategy. Modern acoustic dampening systems on warships and submarines still rely on the fundamental principles he discovered. Noise reduction, vibration isolation, and stealth technologies trace their roots back to the quiet insight of a man who noticed what everyone else had overlooked. His story became part of the U.S. Naval Academy curriculum, teaching future officers the importance of observation, innovation, and courage in problem-solving. Lawson's journey offers a profound lesson. Heroism does not always reside in the spotlight, in medals, or in ranks. Sometimes it resides in the careful observation of a humble individual, in the courage to challenge conventional wisdom, and in the willingness to act when others hesitate. The difference between life and death, between defeat and victory, can rest in the hands of a single person who dares to notice what everyone else misses. The Battle of the Atlantic continued until May 1945, but the tide had irrevocably shifted. Thanks to Lawson's system, the Allies gained control of the seas, ensuring that convoys reached their destinations, supplies reached Britain, and thousands of lives were spared. The U-boat threat, once seemingly unstoppable, was broken not by grand strategy alone, but by a simple, elegant idea executed with precision and courage. In the quiet corners of history, far from headlines and history books, Thomas Patrick Lawson remained a testament to the power of ordinary individuals to shape extraordinary outcomes. His story reminds us that innovation often comes from the least expected places, that curiosity and courage can triumph over expertise and technology, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never seek to be seen. And so, in a war defined by battles, strategies, and machines, it was a cook, with nothing but a keen ear, a notebook, and a mind willing to see what others ignored, who changed the course of naval history. His legacy endured silently, yet powerfully, echoing through the convoys of the Atlantic, the lives saved, and the naval strategies of generations to come. The Atlantic had claimed countless lives, but in the end, it was a quiet genius in a ship's galley who ensured that thousands of sailors returned home. Thomas Patrick Lawson's story remains a testament to the extraordinary impact of ordinary people who dare to notice what others do not.